We have now upwards of 80 million followers or subscribers. We reach over 400 million, primarily Gen Z and millennial sports fans every single month. Now knocking on the door of doing 7 billion video views every single month. And that's enabled us to be the largest publisher in the world on Snapchat. And then on any given month, either the largest or the second or third largest across Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the content category. I'm super excited to be here with Brian. Brian, the CEO of Wave TV. Brian, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I appreciate you having us.
Why are we having this conversation? We looked at well over 1,000 companies in the content category. It was pretty overwhelming, but one of the companies that really stood out to us was Wave TV. Their approach and the ways in which they create content, really engaging content, unique content, and the brands or the different channels that they've created is really impressive. And how they look at the sports content ecosystem as a whole is, I think, quite unique. And then they're also the focus in ways in which they actually distribute content, primarily on social channels, is another unique angle. I think Wave TV is really taking an entirely different look at sports content as a whole, and it's super excited to have you here, Brian, to chat with us. Before we even jump into questions and background of who is Wave TV, we're going to share a short video. I think that just gives you, the audience, at least a good visual of who is Wave TV, and then we'll jump into questions. Sounds good?
Perfect.
Wave is your home for all things sports on YouTube. Subscribe today.
Well, I appreciate it, Brian. Maybe just to start off, you could probably add on top of that, maybe share who is Wave TV, what you guys are doing.
Yeah, of course. And what I generally tell folks is when we started this business some 3.5 years ago, really felt like there was a really simple but also massive misconception within the sports media industry at large, where you had industry insiders, industry leaders, really everyone alike who was up in arms and was saying that sports fandom amongst this next generation is rapidly decreasing. And while I think we would all agree that traditional means of consumption, specifically television ratings, are certainly going down, we felt like that was a misaligned proxy, to measure the overall health of the industry. And the, call it Gen Z and millennial fan, had really just shifted, their viewing habits from the big screen on your wall to the television in your pocket, that being everybody's phone. And then the different social and digital platforms, whether that be Instagram or Snapchat or Facebook or TikTok, YouTube, perhaps it's fair to include the different OTT and streaming services at this point. So with that as a bit of a precursor for everything, we then took a bit of a global approach, in the sense that sport in and of itself is very much inherently global. It's this universal language of sorts, spoken by a lot of different types of people all over the world. And as a result, you end up seeing really dozens, if not hundreds, of these unique fandoms that exist and manifest worldwide. That's everything from your big four, your big five traditional sports, a whole series of non-traditional sports, newer or emerging sports and categories, or really anything else you could possibly imagine in between. And so our playbook has been somewhat simple, in the sense that we've just gone down that list, sport by sport or category by category, to now build this portfolio of 24 different media brands, very much representative of that broad spectrum of fandoms. Then over the last 3.5 years, I'd say we've been laser focused in two distinct or key areas. On one hand, really maximizing our distribution, building our pipes, growing our audience across our portfolio of brands on these social and digital platforms. And then equally, if not more importantly, really mastering the different programming formats. So what I mean by that is understanding, for instance, how do you produce a really successful Snapchat Discover show, Instagram TV series, or call it short form social or digital video in and of itself. And then the third piece of the equation, or question that we asked ourselves rather, was how do we integrate great IP into our programming? And so once again, I think it took a very much global POV here, where all around the world you have hundreds, really thousands of leagues, rights holders, call it IP holders at large, all of whom are, really having a much more difficult time reaching that younger fan, because that younger fan, is indeed watching less and less television. But we saw this really unique opportunity to be able to take those content libraries, short form highlights, in many cases, we're talking decades worth of archival or long tail footage, and turn that around into dozens upon dozens of new hit shows that would naturally be formatted for the platforms where our media brands live. The outcome is certainly less and less of the 60-minute ESPN Sports Center television show, of which I grew up on, and looks more and more like our slate of 3-minute Snap Discover shows, Instagram TV episodes, and so forth. And so fortunately, that's been a playbook that's worked really well across our 24 media brands. We have now upwards of 80 million followers or subscribers. We reach over 400 million, primarily Gen Z and millennial sports fans every single month. I'm now knocking on the door of doing 7 billion video views every single month. And that's enabled us to be the largest publisher in the world on Snapchat. And then on any given month, either the largest or the second or third largest across Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok in no particular order. We're working with, I think, close to 120 different leading global leagues and rights holders. Once again, being able to transform those content libraries to unlock fandom with that highly elusive Gen Z and millennial audience. And then alternatively, with thousands of other, call it IP holders at large, turning either their great underlying stories or their respective content libraries or source footage into a lot of the programming that are produced and distributed across our portfolio on a daily basis.
Wow. All of that in 3 years, you said? It's impressive.
Yeah, about 3.5, yeah.
That's been a ride. It's incredible what you guys have built so far. And it's absolutely impressive. And the foresight we had about, the shift and changing of how a lot of the next generation wants to consume sports content. I want to get into that a little bit later. I first want to focus in on the content itself, the process of creating content, etc. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about you guys is that you have several different channels, several different, I would say, brands. It's just dedicated on creating sports content, distributing across a variety of different social channels. I'm just curious, a lot of your brands are more, they're not necessarily team focused. They're not necessarily like sports league focused. It's a general activity, et cetera. One, why is it for you important to have so many different brands? Two, why did you take this route of not necessarily focusing on teams or leagues or players and went your own route with that?
So it's a great question. And I think this is a core part of our DNA, as well as I think a strong differentiator for us, in the sense that we took this portfolio approach. And it all goes back to this idea that around the world, again, there are literally dozens, probably hundreds of all of these unique fandoms. And if you go back to legacy media, for instance, it was the same 10 stories within the same kind of big four or big five sports that were told on a daily basis across the big screen on your wall. Today's fan is very different. They're much more fluid. They're much more diverse. And we can ask ourselves this really simple question, which is, how can we appeal to as many different types of people with different sensibilities, with different motivations? And the ultimate outcome was, we're going to, go really broad in terms of the spectrum of fandoms that we cover. And then for each, respective sport category fandom, we're going to apply our same, blueprint or playbook and spin up a media brand for that. And that's not to say that we're not covering football, that soccer, American football, basketball, baseball, hockey. We certainly are. That's an inherent part of the global sports ecosystem. But we also cover fandoms like fitness, weightlifting, combat sports, women's sports, cheerleading, gymnastics. And there are large, rabid fan bases within each of those categories that exist at global scale. And so being able to continuously enter new ones and then just provide highly engaging, resonant programming where these fans live, it's really no more complicated than that.
I like a lot of the brands that you created, like you have the Bench Mob or Haymaker, you have the Wave TV, which is the regular one. And I'm just curious how you would come up with these types of brands. Is it, do you just see that a certain theme of content resonates, or there's a fandom there and they just enjoy that and then it evolves into a brand? Or do you test a theme first and see if that resonates? If it's great, you keep it. If you don't like it, you move it to the side. I mean, what's the process for a brand?
Yeah, I think there's a couple, key questions that we ask ourselves, and forgive me if I sound repetitive, but it goes back to the core, the basic premise or a misconception rather. It is just simply, not true that young sports fans are no longer engaged. Like anyone who says that, they're not telling the truth. And so what that told us is that there was this massive unmet need. And then it's where are these fans spending their time? It's all these different social and digital platforms. So that's the number one kind of underlying theme or precursor rather, to our overall approach. Then we look at overall market size. Then, we look at things like, is there enough great IP or are there partners whom we can work with to really have the key inputs to develop our slate of programming? Then the programming itself, I always simplify it down into, to four key buckets. Does it educate? Does it motivate? Does it inspire? Or does it make you laugh? If it does one or multiple or all of those things, it's probably going to be successful, on these platforms because it's going to evoke some sort of emotion, which I think is what, makes, most, if not all of us tick at the end of the day.
One of the questions that I always ask companies within this category, I'm just curious, is content creation for you more of an art form, or is it a lot of more of a creative decision making process?
I think it's a mixture of an art and science, and, how I think oftentimes even frame it internally. I think there's a strong delineation between being a entirely data-driven, content or creative organization versus using, data and analytics to help your best creatives do their job better. And so you can't necessarily replicate the just innate and inherent understanding or skill set that a great storyteller has. There's a reason why, no matter, what medium of media we're talking about, there's a reason why some are better storytellers than others. And fortunately, I think we've been able to identify a lot of the top storytellers in the social and digital space. But then what is very important is to have the right testing framework, to have the right data and analytics stack to simply help those folks do their job better, understand maybe what types of stories they should be thinking about telling, when they should be thinking about telling them, where they should be thinking about telling them or distributing them. And so it becomes this really happy medium of which, if it's instrumented and implemented correctly, I think that gives you a real long-term sustainable advantage.
I want to build off of the latter half of what you talked about, the ways in which you want to distribute content. And this is a really interesting dynamic that I'm still trying to parse through, especially just for any company within the content category as a whole, sports or non-sports. You focus on distributing all your content primarily through other platforms, social networks, you talked about OTT platforms, etc. On the flip side, there tends to be, even in the sports category, or for those who create sports content, they try to have, their own platform that they try to get users to come to, and that's where they want to distribute and control their audience from there. What is your thoughts on this? For you, I feel like the goal was seeing that there is an unmet need for sports content consumption on social channels in a way that would probably younger generation would enjoy more, but then at the same time, you seem to completely not even try to focus on trying to bring users back to your own interface or your own website or your own platform to drive content. Why this approach?
I think, first and foremost, and once again, I think this is true across the history of media, the moat ultimately lies in the distribution. I mean, you can start a website or an app from scratch. You have zero built-in distribution. And you're going to have, unless it is somewhat of a moonshot and it's like really sticky from day one, it's a bit of an uphill battle versus the approach that we took. And I'd probably talk about this ad nauseum because it makes me laugh sometimes. It's just like, this isn't that complicated. Like, where everyone in the world essentially has a cell phone. And on those cell phones, everyone has these apps. So you're talking about billions of people whom you're able to reach. And this is where they're going to discover new things, to discover these fandoms, to engage with them. And sometimes it's admittedly frustrating because it's like, why are we even beginning to overthink this? This isn't how, or at least the legacy way of consumption. That's not how today's fan behaves. Now, that's not to say that you can't then leverage your distribution to start building different owned and operated experiences. But again, if you believe that the moat lies in the distribution, now you have a long-term competitive advantage to actually start moving your most rabid fans into more owned and operated experiences versus starting with nothing and kind of hoping that they come.
No, it definitely makes sense. And it seems like there's always this component of the discoverability aspect. Like you mentioned, everyone's on these platforms.
Yeah. Another way of thinking about it is like television, right? If you were creating a show for a television network, that's not your audience. And so you were, at the mercy of maybe there was some politics and, they decided to not renew the show for season 2, or maybe the show just kind of sucked and nobody watched it, so it doesn't get renewed. It's the same dynamic on these platforms. They're really the cable networks of the future. So if you treat people really well, if you delight your fans on a daily basis and you put up numbers, you're going to do really well. It's no different than the traditional kind of cable model in that sense.
And one of the things that it seems like for you is distributing content, especially on these social media platforms, and probably take a much different approach towards obviously creating content and the quantity of content that you have to put out there. And I'm just curious, how do you balance between this, especially for just general companies within the content category as a whole? How do you balance this mix of quality and quantity? And I'm assuming you probably post different content on different types of social channels. Is there a right mix for you guys?
I think quality in this context is very subjective. At the end of the day, the end fan, they're really voting with their thumbs, meaning, they're either going to stop and they're going to subscribe or follow you. They're going to discover you in the feed and they're going to spend time watching that IGTV or that Snap or that TikTok or what have you. Or they're even going to go a layer deeper and they're going to like, or they're going to comment on it. That has nothing to do with how many dollars you spent per minute of production. In fact, we live at a time where something like memes are very much a part of the cultural zeitgeist. So at the end of the day, it's all about, did the audience love it? Did they engage with it? Do they continue to engage with it on a consistent basis? And then back to those 4 pillars of educating, motivating, inspiring, making people laugh. If you're checking those boxes, then odds are, whether you spent $1 million producing something or whether you spent $1 producing it, if it delights the fan, then I think it's high quality.
Especially for sports content, when someone's filming somebody playing like street basketball and there's an incredible play. It doesn't matter how quality. Well, I have to ask, just because I'm just curious to get your perspective on this. Does it make you nervous, or does it ever worry you guys when you rely on putting your content on these platforms as opposed to having kind of your own website or channel?
No, I mean, I think I touched on this, a bit a few moments ago. Again, I think, or we think of, the social and digital platforms as really the cable networks of the future. And so, if you continue to delight those fan bases, engage them, produce, high quality programming, on a daily basis, then I think that you're gonna, shed a positive light on yourselves and your overall business, and be a really additive partner. If you treat people poorly, both your partners, or you treat your fans poorly, meaning you don't service them at the highest levels and entertain them, then you're probably not going to do as well. And then your content is going to be shown to less people, and your overall business is going to be hurt. I think another really interesting part of this is we're soon to be in a cookieless world where having that more kind of legacy O&O is probably going to be a little bit less valuable in terms of the data conundrum that I think is often at the top of everybody's mind. All these platforms are now instrumented to be able to facilitate the transaction within their walls. And so a company like us that has built this moat by way of distribution across these core and emerging social and digital platforms, I think actually becomes now even more additive to all the various partners alike.
I actually now want to just take a step back from the product itself and the ways that you're creating content and dive back into what you mentioned in the very beginning, and we've talked a little bit at a few times. One of the things that you mentioned, and basis of Wave TV seems to be zeroing in on what a lot of users actually want to watch related to sports content, especially the younger generation. And you have a great visual on your website that kind of gives insight into how sports consumption is evolving over time. I highly encourage everyone to check it out. It's really interesting. But I just wanted to ask and zero in on this is, why do you think sports consumption or traditional sports content, why is that dropping? Is it just content format? Is it the content length? Is it just, is there a reason?
I think it's all somewhat subjective in terms of how it's framed, in the sense that are less people tuning into linear? Absolutely. But I think even using the NBA postseason or finals as a proxy, if I'm not mistaken, it was the most highly engaged year that they've ever had across social and digital. And what that says is that the fandom is still as healthy as ever. Just the means of consumption have changed. We live in a much different world than, I'm 33, almost 34 years old. We live in a much different world, than when even I grew up. Your primary means of consumption were that 2 to 3 hour game. It was Stewart, Scott Van Pelt, Linda Cohen, etc. on that hour-long Sports Center, of which, ironically, me being a massive Cleveland fan, you'd sit and watch the hour-long show for the 2-minute highlight of your favorite team. And so it's interesting that comes full circle, because now it's just, the discoverability and the kind of, call it ease at which fans can consume those 2 to 3 minutes that they really care about. That's what the smartphone and the different programming formats on these platforms have really enabled.
And I know you talked about, I think even in that deck that's on your website, going off that NBA example, saying that you mentioned they had the lowest recorded ratings in history based on the last final. But then you're saying that their social channels were the highest in engagement that has ever been.
I might be misspeaking, but if I'm not mistaken, I think that overall engagement was at an all-time high, even though linear consumption, might not have been what it was in years past.
I want to dive into that a little bit more real quick on just the evolution of content overall, but I was just curious. I wanted to ask, before we get into more of just general market questions, the business model that you have, given that you're focused primarily on distributing through social networks, is it you working directly with brands and then doing some type of relationship and brand partnerships, or what is this ways that you guys sustain yourself?
So at least in the short and medium term, and I ironically don't, think this, is framed terribly dissimilar to television in a sense. I think of being on the platforms and, call it earning revenue as a function of viewership to an extent. It's like a carriage fee. And then on those platforms, let's use Snap as an example, a great partner of ours. We have 14 shows on Discover, soon to be launching many more. Within every single one of those shows, there's a 6-second commercial, or I should say multiple 6-second commercials. That is really much akin to the 30-second or 60-second spot that you would see on television. So every time those commercials run, we make money. And that in and of itself can be highly profitable. And that same type of commercial, albeit they have different names on different platforms, is starting to exist and manifest across Facebook. It's certainly been on YouTube for a long time. If I was a betting man, I think you'll start to see it on Instagram, IGTV, on TikTok. It certainly exists across the different AVOD platforms. So that in and of itself, if you build your company the right way, can be highly lucrative. Then the unique part about sports is the whole sports sponsorship angle, and how do you start directly selling sponsorships to brands and advertisers that have historically spent tens of billions of dollars either against programming slates or against rights partners. I think ESPN's College Football Game Day, it's brought to you by Home Depot. I think most people understand that, right? We have dozens upon dozens of these hit shows that we have been working on for the last 3.5 years, of which you could slot in the same type of presenting sponsorship. Or alternatively, if you think about it on a sport by sport or a rights holder by rights holder basis, take a rights holder X, right? That rights holder is realistically having a much harder time reaching younger fans. That rights holder also has a whole series of massive endemic sponsors that have historically spent a lot of money in this particular space. Because that rights holder is having a harder time reaching younger fans, the ROI on those dollars towards that Gen Z and millennial fan base is continually becoming, call it, harder and harder to maximize or sustain. And so we want to position ourselves as this really simple, scalable, and tactile way for brands and sponsors to directly integrate, into our whole slate of programming.
It's really interesting to see that sports has that bigger, a slightly different angle, especially with sponsors, and seeing how you guys can leverage that in unique ways going forward. I think it's going to be really exciting for Wave TV. We might be repeating ourselves a little bit, but I just wanted to ask a couple more times, just because media from the outside in seems to be super challenging because content's changing, content formats are changing. There are different platforms that are constantly, new social networks that emerge. And I feel like you've already on the forward trend, especially for sports category, seeing how content's evolving, how to play to that. And I don't know if you have thoughts about content evolving in new ways or in different ways going forward. And how do you see Wave TV in that evolution?
I don't think it's going back to how it used to be, which I think is one part of your question. Do I think that there might be a world in which new, platforms or means of consumption pop up in the, ensuing years or decades? Yeah, probably. Do I think that the existing platforms that are already household names will continue to innovate, will continue to position themselves as this kind of vertically integrated entertainment stack? Absolutely. You look at what the Snaps of the world are doing between Discover and Spotlight and Lens, AR, VR, Snap Minis, so on and so forth, as well as some of the other platforms of whom we work with. It's all about amassing more and more attention, entertaining fans in a different way. And then that becomes additive to modern day entertainment companies, like ourselves, which is how can we leverage the toolkit at our disposal to be the best possible partners for our platform partners. And then what goes hand in hand with that is maximizing the ways in which we can entertain our fans.
I look at you guys as already in that evolution of what is next for content, especially within this category of sports. And so it's exciting to see kind of here at the forefront. Last question I had for you is, what do you think is the future of sports content or consumption? And what do you see that most people don't?
I'm obviously biased, but I think a model where you have this kind of series of assets or holdings that is very much distributed, which maximizes the amount of attention that you can gather from a global fan base, is ultimately going to lead to this kind of rising tide dynamic that's in the best interest of all of the various stakeholders, whether that be leagues and rights holders, whether that be platforms, whether that be fans, whether that be brands and sponsors. Do I think that linear television or the kind of 2 or 3 hour game is just going to evaporate? Absolutely not. There's still a massive fan base, all things considered, that are tuning in. I'm still one of them, for instance. But I think to really set up the industry for decades upon decades worth of continual success, I think having the mindfulness and the adaptability to really lean into the toolkits that these various platforms provide, or of which, call it, modern day entertainment companies like Wave TV can provide in parallel. Just being a sports fan and caring a tremendous amount about the industry, I think it's of the utmost importance, even paramount, for leaders and, call it, stakeholders alike to lean into these shifting tides and where the market's headed.
This is fantastic, Brian. I think it was. I really appreciate you taking the time. Share a lot of insights on not only what you guys have been doing, how you look at how sports content and the ecosystem changing. I really appreciate it. Before I close out, did you have anything that you'd like to share, announce, or ask to the audience?
First and foremost, or once again, thanks for having me and having us. It's very much appreciated. And then if anyone ever wants to reach out to me, personally, I generally try to get back to everyone. Feel free to shoot me a line or add me on LinkedIn, what have you.
Well, Brian, again, I really appreciate it. And for the audience, why we had this conversation, we looked at well over 1,000 companies or startups within the content category, within the media industry. And one of the companies that really stood out to us was Wave TV. They've done an absolutely impressive job looking at how sports content consumption is changing, especially with the younger generation, and really catering to that in a way that's both, I think, unique to all the different fandoms that are arising but you've done an absolutely impressive job with how you've scaled up to billions of views in less than 3 years' time. And obviously you're doing a fantastic job in this category, but also the ways in which you look at creating content or you distribute content. I think overall, Wave TV, I think, has done a fantastic job really innovating on how sports consumption is going forward. And it's also very interesting to see how you see that the monetization opportunities, especially within this category, and leveraging the platforms and the relationships that you're building across these platforms too. It's absolutely, we're talking tens of millions of subscribers across many different platforms, across many different brands. It's unreal. So with that, Brian, again, I really appreciate it.
Thank you.